Missing schoolgirl Johanna Bornacker is dead.
How did she meet her death?
Despite a massive police search, the 8-year-old had vanished without trace. And still, nobody knows what has happened to her.
She was in the wrong place at the wrong time.
We performed digital forensic tests on a huge scale.
They'd carried the secret with them for 18 years.
The Jetta witness was the only one we had.
Have we got the right person? Every test proved negative. Police have no clues as to the killer.
In Hesse, the Johanna Bornacker case took top priority.
One of the most spectacular murder cases of the last 20 years.
The murder has destroyed an entire family. Life will never be the same. Even for the rest of the village. When did Johanna die? It is vital for us to find answers to that and other questions.
Bobenhausen, 50 kilometers north of Frankfurt. For nearly 20 years, its 500 inhabitants lived with an unsolved crime.
The Johanna Bornacker case dates back to September 2nd, 1969.
Das Wetter war gut, soweit ich das noch in Erinnerung habe.
As I remember it, the weather was fine.
Durchaus ein öffentlich einsehbarer Art. Also da am Sportplatz hat es auch noch ein Fußball.
At the local sports ground, they were making early preparations for a football match that evening against a team from a neighboring village.
An dem gleichen Abend noch Fußball gespielt.
In the afternoon, it was still quiet at the football ground, some 500 meters from the center of the village. Kickoff wasn't until 6 p.m. So like she often did, Johanna got together there with some of her friends.
Johanna and the other girls played next to the sports ground. But after a while, they went off with their parents to visit friends or relatives in the next village. So Johanna stayed behind on her own.
Around 5 o'clock, Johanna set off home. She must have stopped briefly at the wooden seat next to the bridge over the Leisbach, a small stream that flows half-hidden right next to the sports ground.
Johanna's parents had told her to be back by a certain time. When she failed to show up, they became worried. Her father and her sister set out to look for her. But all they found was her bike on the cycle path at the Bobenhausen sports ground.
It seemed unlikely that Johanna would leave her yellow bike on the cycle path. She loved it more than anything else.
The case began when Johanna's father rang the police to report his daughter missing. He told them he had found her bike next to a seat by the stream, but she was nowhere to be seen.
By now, Johanna had been missing for 2 hours. So where was the little girl? Johanna was a reliable and punctual child.
After the match, there was uproar. A little girl was missing. The police had already arrived at the sports ground. The local fire brigade had also been alerted to help search for the child. This was the first time we'd had to mount a search operation for a missing child. Groups needed to be formed, and the search coordinated with dog teams. The area to be searched was extensive, so we were allocated a certain section and covered it together.
The teams of helpers still assumed that the child had had an accident.
If a child has had an accident, it's vital to find it as quickly as possible because you don't know the nature of its injuries. And if it's got lost and is frightened, it can walk on and on. Then you need to search a really big area.
But Johanna was nowhere to be found. So with darkness falling, around 9:30, the search was called off for the day.
Every year, around 100,000 people are reported missing. That's 200 to 300 a day. But every day, 200 to 300 also turn up again. 98% of all cases where a child is reported missing are quickly cleared up. In the other 2%, it's vital to realize that there could be a serious life or death problem and that every second counts.
Early in the morning on September 3rd, 1969, the search for Johanna continued.
At the moment, we have no indication that a crime has been committed, but it can't be ruled out.
Over 200 police officers were now searching for the child.
When a child that is normally reliable and should have been home 2 hours ago goes missing without a trace in broad daylight, and its bike is found lying on a cycle path, the police react very, very quickly.
You can't imagine a worse situation. Any crime in which a child suffers is always horrific. And when a little girl disappears, you've always got the thought at the back of your mind that there might be a tragic ending to the case.
Good evening and welcome to the regional news. One of the worst nightmares for parents is when their child is missing. They go looking for it, but without success. This is what happened in Randstadt-Bobenhausen. 8-year-old Johanna has been missing since yesterday evening. The police immediately mounted a search, which will be continued today.
In their search for Johanna in the broad woodland area around Bobenhausen, the police are being helped by the voluntary fire brigade and by neighbours and friends of the family.
It's clear that a missing child has to be found as quickly as possible. The longer the search takes, of course, the greater the risk to the child.
No one had any idea what had happened. Because of the proximity of the stream, at first it was thought that Johanna might have had an accident. No one could shed any light on her disappearance.
Right from the start, the search must cover as much ground as possible.
Over 200 officers combed the surrounding area.
Basically, we again searched all the places we'd searched the day before. Our dogs would definitely have kicked off if they'd have found anything. And the police used their tracker dogs too, but sadly, to no avail. The worst thing was the powerlessness, the impotence, the feeling that there was nothing you could do. The longer we searched, the worse that feeling got. We all said it was terrible, really terrible. The police have released this picture of the missing Johanna Bornacker. She is wearing a brightly coloured t-shirt and jeans.
The State Office of Criminal Investigation was involved right from the start. When young children are missing, you get this weird feeling. You hope for the best and fear for the worst. Yet you always hope that perhaps she has only got lost and will turn up again. There is still no trace of missing 8-year-old Johanna Bornacker. Today, the area around Bobenhausen is being combed.
Divers also searched the flooded quarry at Randstadt-Bobenhausen, not far from her home. The police had no firm indication that she might have drowned, but they wanted to be certain. The surrounding woods had already been searched, so now they were focusing their search on the local lakes and rivers.
You can't see a thing down there. You have to feel your way around. Every time you pick up a rock or a branch, you say to yourself, I hope this isn't what I'm looking for.
At midday, the search of the quarry was called off. Divers had found nothing. The police had no direct leads. Ultimately, they had to face the possibility that Johanna wouldn't be found at all. Meanwhile, a week had passed. Johanna's parents were expecting the worst.
We think that Johanna has been abducted and that the people who have her in their power want to use her for child pornography purposes or whatever. The most important thing for people like that is money. So we hope that if we can get enough money together, we'll be able to buy her freedom. We don't really care who gets paid off. We want our daughter back, and if necessary, we'll pay the kidnapper.
Bobenhausen was in a state of shock. By now, the police too were thinking in terms of a crime. So initially, everyone was a suspect.
Right from the start, the police and the public prosecutor's office ruled nothing out. They thought it possible that Johanna had been abducted by someone with no links at all to Bodenhausen. We also thought that it could be a resident of Bodenhausen, even a friend of the family. Naturally, we also had to investigate the family itself. Were there any problems? Were there any indications that there might perhaps have been an accident that needed to be covered up? These are all questions which, when we investigators put them, are incredibly stressful for the family.
When a child is killed, it's usually the parents who are responsible. Statistically, the parents are the most dangerous individuals in a child's life. So naturally, the police have to rule them out first. But that didn't make things better for the village. On the contrary, the situation became a lot worse. Because the fact that the parents were innocent meant that anyone could be implicated, a neighbour, the sports teacher, or a good friend. And this kind of uncertainty for parents who no longer wanted to let their children play out, but also for neighbours who suspected one another, is an absolutely exceptional situation you wouldn't wish on any village or any person.
Naturally, the police tried to question as many people as possible, Johanna's friends and their parents. People who had been out on a walk got in touch with the police, along with one or two people who had seen Johanna near the sports ground.
In the evening, we were contacted by a witness who proved to be of tremendous importance in the further course of our investigations. It was a man who said he was driving to Bodenhausen when he noticed that the car in front of him had HG on its number plate, an indication that it was from a different region.
That evening I was running late. Kick-off was at 6 and I was still on my way from Randstadt to Belmont. The only reason I remember the car in front was because it was doing just 30 or 40. On that road, there's normally a stretch where you can overtake, and I made use of it. As I overtook, I glanced to one side and caught the driver's profile. He was unshaven and had a ponytail. I went home, got my sports kit and drove to the sports ground. That same car was parked there.
He claimed to have seen the vehicle around 5:23 p.m. What made it stick in his mind was that it was parked directly on the cycle path, which, of course, is against the law. This was also the spot where Johanna disappeared.
Did the driver of the Jetta really have something to do with Johanna's disappearance? Is it possible that Manfred Wirth saw the perpetrator at the sports ground? His statement remained the only useful lead.
It was partly because of his profession that the witness was able to describe the vehicle so well. As a car mechanic, he was familiar with all kinds of makes, so it wasn't unusual for him to provide such a detailed description. Many people who see a vehicle can't remember afterwards what make it was, because they normally see so many. But that was no problem for him. So his description was really valuable, because the police were able to rely on it.
In the case of the Jetta witness, two coincidences came together. Because of his professional knowledge, he noticed that this wasn't just any Jetta, it had been lowered. What's more, the driver had annoyed him. I think that is an important reason why these details stuck in his mind. He was annoyed, his emotions were stirred. We can all imagine what he felt when he was in a hurry and the car in front was crawling along doing just 30 in a 50-kilometre zone. It got his dander up. This was the only reason why he glanced to one side as he overtook and looked at the driver. His professional experience ensured that he remembered the car, and his emotions, his agitation, made him remember the other information.
First of all, of course, the police focused on this vehicle and made contact with the Federal Motor Transport Authority. They learned that well over 500 Jettas had the letters HG in their number plate, so they all had to be checked out. The effort involved in inspecting every single car for modifications and running the rule over the owner was enormous. But sadly, investigators drew a blank. The amount of work involved in checking so many vehicles was so great, in fact, that it had to be carried out with the assistance of special police from other areas.
Our best lead was the Volkswagen Jetta, which at the time in question was within the area of the sports ground, driven by a man with a ponytail.
Investigators drove to Friedrichsdorf to take a look at the vehicle, which was owned by a certain Rick J. But they were skeptical because of the color of the car they saw in Friedrichsdorf didn't tally with the description given by the witness.
At first, detectives who saw the vehicle were irritated. It fitted the description very closely, but the color was not what the witness had described.
The car I overtook between Randstadt and Bellmuth was brown, and it was still brown when I drove on from Bellmuth to Bobenhausen.
First of all, senior task force members were informed. They got in touch with the witness and asked him to accompany them. He agreed and travelled to Friedrichsdorf with 4 detectives to take a look at the car. In the meantime, 2 of the detectives had gone upstairs to talk to Rick J. They asked him about his whereabouts around the time Johanna disappeared. The information he provided made it impossible for him to have been in Bobenhausen.
But what about his car?
The 2 other investigators and the witness went into the underground garage.
There was this Jetta standing there. But it wasn't brown. I think it was blue. But it had the lowered chassis and everything.
He was convinced the car was the wrong color and ruled it out.
Emotions often help us to remember things better. Nevertheless, our perception is still highly selective. Sometimes it's the color of someone's eyes that we recall, or their hair. Sometimes a make of car, sometimes its color. It seems contradictory that we should remember the make of a car but not its color. However, depending on the light conditions, with some kinds of car paint, our perception can be fuzzy. If the car was neither definitely blue nor definitely brown, it might be hard to remember the exact color, because at that moment it wasn't totally clear.
Because of the neon light in the garage, perhaps? Or was Rick J. simply lucky?
The investigators had to accept what Manfred Wirth told them. They informed their two colleagues up at the apartment that the witness had ruled out the car.
So the police assumed that wasn't the person they were looking for. But they questioned him anyway. Since he appeared to have an alibi, he was no longer a prime suspect. The lead had been followed up, but to no avail. The investigation into Johanna's disappearance had reached a dead end.
As a detective, it's hard to admit that despite all your efforts, you don't have a single lead, you've absolutely nothing to indicate what happened to Johanna Bonacker. That is really tough. You begin to wonder if you're doing your job properly. As a detective, you put your heart and soul into solving such crimes, especially where children are involved. That goes without saying. So, it was really bitter for the team to admit that they had reached a point where they had not even a single lead.
The little girl has now been missing for 8 weeks. Hundreds of police have been involved in the search for her.
Richard and Gabriele Bonacker distributed thousands of posters and flyers. The police followed up more than 2,000 leads.
We miss Johanna so much. We're not in mourning because you can only mourn someone you know is dead.
For a long time, the police had nothing at all to go on. But things changed on April the 4th, 2000, when people walking in the woods near Alsfeld found the remains of a girl's body.
It was that of Johanna Bonacker.
Good evening, here's the news. Johanna Bonacker, the 8-year-old from Randstadt-Bobenhausen who went missing 6 months ago, is dead.
For more than half a year, the parents lived in hope. Today they received the terrible news that their daughter was murdered. Her remains were found in a wood near the Frankfurt-Kassel motorway.
Around 100 police officers searched the dense undergrowth within a radius of half a kilometer from where the body was discovered.
So far, we've found a skull, some hair and other parts. So quite a lot is still missing, probably because of wild animals. There are signs that wild boars have been in the woods here.
Only a few remains were found at the site, a cranial bone and the remnants of a shock of hair.
Wrapped around the hair was adhesive tape. When measured, it was found to be 15 meters in length. Now, that's a lot. So we had to ask ourselves, why so much tape? What role could it have played in the crime?
Covering 3 hectares, the wood near the motorway was searched metre by metre. With their highly sensitive noses, besides bones, police tracker dogs even found textile remnants no bigger than a postage stamp.
Since all we found were a few human remains, real evidence was sparse. It included bits of rope.
A lot of adhesive tape was found, 2 different types in fact, silvery duct tape and brownish packing tape, along with scraps of Johanna's clothing.
We found roughly half the pair of jeans Johanna had been wearing and about the same amount of her T-shirt. We identified that from the Mickey Mouse print on it.
Yesterday, Johanna's parents confirmed that the clothing was Johanna's.
Our hopes have been dashed. I now know where she is and that she is gone forever. For 7 long months, there was still a chance that at some time or other I might get her back. It wouldn't have been the Hannah I lost, but she would at least have been there. Now all hope is gone.
Aber jetzt ist alles aus.
The situation was clear. A child had been abducted and murdered, but the exact circumstances were, of course, totally unknown, nor had we any idea who was responsible.
The body had been hastily buried in a shallow grave next to a path. Basically, there are 3 possible explanations as to why the killer did not take more care. The first is time. He might have been under stress and simply didn't have time to bury the body more deeply or conceal it better. The second possible explanation is indifference. Time and again we notice that perpetrators of this kind simply have no fear of being caught. Often they fail to wear gloves and in many other ways don't worry about leaving evidence behind. The third possible explanation is a certain lack of emotional intelligence, the inability to see things through the eyes of the police. What would they look for? What might they find? And what conclusions would they draw? Some killers simply lack the empathy to take this mental step.
In such cases, investigators first focus on material evidence, DNA, fingerprints, and fibers. And that is what happened here.
The finds from the wood were sent to the State Office of Criminal Investigation in Wiesbaden, where they were analyzed by Angelika Schwetz.
Everything that had been found in the wood and could have provided clues, the clothing remnants and the adhesive tape, were quickly sent here.
Die sind sehr zeitnah hier angeliefert worden zur Untersuchung auf Spuren.
Securing adequate traces was a problem.
The body had been in the wood, exposed to the elements for about 7 months. So there wasn't much left apart from scraps of clothing and the adhesive tape. And even they revealed no traces of DNA.
The adhesive tape found in the wood was of great importance. It was 15 meters long, And that's a lot.
Adhesive tape is excellent for carrying traces of all kinds of material, especially fibres. The clothing remnants were all tangled up, so we first had to separate them step by step. Under the microscope, we were able to collect individual fibres. My colleague was then asked to inspect the adhesive tape for any clues. She decided to start with the shortest piece, section 11. When she placed it under the microscope, she immediately spotted part of a hand or a fingerprint. She made a note of it, and after any fibres had been removed from the tape, she sent it on to our fingerprint specialists.
Because it had been exposed to the elements, the quality of the print was poor. But in those days, it was hard to tell if the print had come from a finger or the palm of a hand. The minute size of the print was also a problem.
But the print wasn't the only thing investigators discovered.
Traces of fibre, lots of them, in fact, were found not only on section 11. They were typical carpet fibres. And when we find fibres like that, they usually came from the boot of a car. Since the body must have been transported, the indication that the fibres came from a car boot came as no surprise. And we also found lots of grey acrylic fibres.
Wir hatten außerdem noch so graue Acrylfasern in sehr großer Zahl.
In the 1990s, acrylic was a common material, comparable with polyester today. At the time, lots of fluffy pullovers contained the material. Acrylic was also used to make gloves as well as car seat covers. Any material that was a bit fluffy was a potential source of acrylic fibres. Because we had so many fibres, we knew that the source had to be something of a fair size.
A partial handprint and traces of fibres had been found next to the human remains. But without some other DNA for comparison purposes, the evidence could never be used to ascertain the identity of the killer. So initially, what the investigators had in their hands was worthless.
Ist das, was sie gefunden haben, erstmal vorläufig wertlos.
Es ist natürlich so, dass der Leichenfund letztendlich
Ultimately, the discovery of Johanna's remains put the police under even more pressure. Now, the nature of the crime was clear, so it was a new situation. However, only scant evidence had been found. To get the case moving again, the police task force was increased in size.
The task force believed that the discovery of Johanna's remains would lead them a step closer to the killer.
It has given us fresh hope of making a breakthrough. The police are now receiving more potential leads from callers. Investigators also want to take another look at previous leads. Consequently, the task force in Friedberg has been increased in size. The only way the murder of 8-year-old Johanna can be solved is through great attention to detail and perhaps a stroke of luck. All the police had at this point were 2 physical clues, a partial handprint and traces of fibres. There was also the witness statement about a Jetta with a lowered chassis and part of a number plate, plus a rough psychological profile of a male aged 20 to 40, possibly from the area and with a predilection for bondage games. How did the police know this? Through reference to past cases. The standard profile pointed to a male between 20 and 40. Perpetrators of the kind in question often commit their crimes within their comfort zone, in places where they live or work. The police knew all this, but they had nothing to match their evidence with.
The partial print was, of course, examined under the microscope. Investigators tried to isolate this tiny scrap and then checked the data bank for any matches. But there weren't any. This could also mean that the killer was someone who had never been involved in any criminal proceedings. So it was decided that mass screening was necessary.
With the focus still on every male in Bobenhausen, suspicion was rife.
Es war eine Männerhand, die Johanna tötete.
The partial handprint police were able to secure shows Johanna was killed by a man. That is why men from the village and the surrounding area have come voluntarily to the community hall in Bobenhausen to have their handprint taken.
Dieses Fragment eines Fingerabdrucks hat man also in der Folge dann.
This fragment of a handprint that had been secured prompted the police to request all men of a certain age who were living in the area to go to Bobenhausen for an initial mass screening. As I remember it, more than 500 turned up.
Das waren meines Wissens nach auch über 500, die letztlich da überprüft worden sind.
The press had a feast day, but for us, going to be checked was never even an issue. It's a good idea. I took part to get the case solved.
I'm taking part because I've got grandchildren and I want this man to be caught.
I've given a handprint. I wanted to set a good example. And besides, there are still rumours going round that I killed my daughter myself. And I wanted to put a stop to all that.
The handprint from Johanna's father proved his innocence once and for all.
Ein Fingerabdruck ist immer dann eine gute Spur.
When it can clearly identify a person, a finger or handprint is obviously excellent evidence. The problem here, though, was that the print was of such poor quality that even if we had the culprit sitting in front of us and had taken his prints for comparison purposes, there might still be no guarantee of a match.
800 left and right-hand prints were taken. Investigators hoped that by scanning them and comparing them with the evidence, they would come up trumps, that the murderer would be among the samples. But they soon drew a blank. None of the 800 men in the Bogenhausen area had touched the adhesive tape. Johanna's killer was still at large.
How can we live with the knowledge that society produces such people? All I can say is that when you've spent over 40 years as a detective, your experiences have made you more than aware of the depths of the human soul. You know full well what human beings can be capable of, and that there are those in our midst who live with inclinations you don't even want to think about.
Überall alle möglichen Menschen mit Neigungen leben, von denen man sich gar keine Vorstellungen so wirklich machen kann.
In the meantime, police have another murder on their hands. And once again, the victim is a blonde, 8-year-old girl.
Johanna Bonacker disappeared in her home village of Randstadt-Bobenhausen on September 2nd, 1969. Half a year later, her remains were found 50 kilometers away in a wood near Alsfeld. Julia Hose was abducted last Friday in Biebertal. Her body was found 45 kilometers away. All 4 locations lie within a radius of some 50 kilometers. Is this a coincidence, or were they killed by the same person, possibly someone who lives in or knows the area?
Insofern macht man sich natürlich schon Gedanken.
When 2 crimes show similar features like time and place, you automatically wonder if there is a connection.
The thought that the murderer could be at large in the area is frightening. Not only could you come face to face with him one day, he might even be someone who mourned with you and offered his help. As long as this man is at large, no child is safe. He could kill again.
Solange dieser Täter frei rumläuft, ist kein Kind sicher vor einer Wiederholungstat.
In such situations, family members behave in totally different ways. Some withdraw completely and shut themselves off from society. Others become proactive because, hoping for leads, they want to keep the crime fresh in people's minds. Where the press is concerned, they go on the offensive. In this case, Johanna's mother sought public attention just to keep people thinking about the case and, of course, ultimately to find out precisely what happened to her daughter.
3 years ago, our Johanna went out to play and never came back. For 3 years now, we have been mourning our dead child. You killed our happy, bubbly, feisty Johanna. Talk to us. Write to us in any way. Answer our questions. Help us to understand. We beg you. Help us. Get in touch.
Will the killer respond? Investigators still had no clues as to the killer's identity, so now they set up the Jetta unit and focused on their only lead, the driver of the VW Jetta. 600 Jetta owners were invited to have their fingerprints taken, and for the first time a new procedure was used.
It was only in the first decade of this century that everything was digitized. The live scan process enabled fingerprints to be scanned in 3D, so to speak.
It was now hoped that the extensive search for a corresponding handprint would take investigators a big step further.
We asked a large number of people, including Jetta owners, to have their finger and handprints taken voluntarily once again.
It was a highly personnel-intensive operation, one we wouldn't have mounted if we hadn't thought it would really help.
The Jetta was certainly the best lead, so obviously that is what the investigation had to focus on.
Naturally, the Jetta drivers also included Rick J.
Colleagues refrained from asking him to have his fingerprints taken once again, because they were already in the system from previous investigations.
Instead of using the new scanning procedure, in Rick J's case, investigators continued to rely on the old fingerprints that had been taken with ink. It was a grave error.
As it turned out, parts of the handprint on the adhesive tape were not covered by the print which we had been given. So there could not have been any match.
A fingerprint is unique. Even the fingerprints of identical twins are only similar. They're not identical. So any part of a fingerprint is extremely important. Being unique, it can clearly identify someone. But a fingerprint is like a barcode. And if you only have one line of a barcode, you don't have the full code. You need a minimum of information. The relationship of the lines to one another and the shape of the lines. You have to have a minimal section of the overall picture to say with certainty that the print could only have come from this one person, and thus convince a court.
Klar sagen zu können, dass dies nur von einer Person stammen kann und auch das Gericht davon zu überzeugen.
It's now 5.5 years since the parents of 8-year-old Johanna Bornacker from Bobenhausen in Hesse lost their beloved daughter. Yet every day is still filled with sadness and grief.
Es ist uns wichtig zu erfahren, wann Johanna gestorben ist.
It is important for us to know when Johanna died and the exact circumstances of her death. Why did he have to abduct her? Why couldn't he just let her go home?
Das sind einfach die Fragen, die ich habe und
we need to know the answer.
Die beantwortet werden müssen für uns.
But no matter what steps investigators took, the police would not be able to provide answers for many years.
In all those years, my colleagues in Friedberg never let up. New approaches were tried time and again. They also turned repeatedly to the general public. They wanted to make sure that the case would not be forgotten, that people would still think and talk about it.
In Randstadt-Bobenhausen, the police put up a large poster of Johanna Bornacker to remind people of her disappearance 10 years ago. They hoped it might produce new leads. But it didn't. Anyone in Bobenhausen could still be the killer. Even in the years that followed, the little village never found peace.
15 years have passed since 8-year-old Johanna Bornacker from Randstadt Bobenhausen was murdered. Now police are reopening the case.
Because they still have no idea exactly what happened.
Not a year passed without people or the press asking about the case and wanting to know why it hadn't been solved. We all told ourselves that such a terrible crime could not go unpunished.
That is why the police repeatedly turned to the general public, even if it just meant putting up posters in Bobenhausen on the anniversary of her disappearance, or having the occasional spot on a TV crime program. Time and again, attempts like that were made to keep the case alive and perhaps produce fresh leads.
Two crime scene programs have again focused on the unsolved murder of Johanna Bornacker. As a result, the police have received 65 possible leads. Up to now, their investigation has focused on the man whose identikit picture looks like this.
We based our search on this picture. Off and on, we received leads which we checked out, but none was of any real significance. So basically, in late 2014 and early 2015, we actually had nothing. No new leads, no new approach. It was a difficult time.
Johanna's murder had become a cold case. There were no new leads. All old leads were regarded as more or less checked out.
Over the years, we ran the rule over suspects, fabric from car interiors, pieces of clothing and so on, in search of fibre traces. But we drew a blank. Some of our tests were really comprehensive, but they all proved negative. We just couldn't find the type of fibres we were looking for. So when there were no new leads, and there is no fresh input from above, a case has to be shelved. It's not as if Johanna Bornacker's murder was the only violent death in the state of Hesse. At some point, you just have to put the case to one side and focus on something else. But inwardly, you never close an unsolved case.
16 years after Johanna's disappearance, investigators had given up hope of finding her killer, but her parents hadn't.
There have been enough cases that were solved after 20 years. So why should our case be any different?
By this time, the Bornackers no longer lived in Bobenhausen. They couldn't take it anymore. As newcomers, they had never really been accepted in the village. After Johanna's body was found, hardly anyone came to see them. So as early as 2000, they left. In 2016, 17 years after her disappearance, Richard Bornacker passed away without ever knowing who murdered his daughter.
I hope, indeed I believe, that such cases can be solved, with new criminological and analytical methods, with psychology, and sometimes with new investigators taking a fresh look at the old data. I think the Johanna Bornacker case is the best proof that even cold cases are only temporarily unsolvable. Sometimes it takes just a fresh look at old leads.
Shortly after Richard Bornacker's death, the investigation suddenly gathered pace.
In 2016, I got a call from 3 young detectives who had not been involved in the initial investigation in 1999. They wanted to reopen the case and take a fresh look at everything.
They hoped to find something which in the past had not been regarded as particularly important, but which could perhaps result in the case being solved.
The first thing they did was to suggest that the file, which was comprised solely of papers, be digitized, that even the smallest note be scanned in. Some of our leads were simply written on yellow memos, but since they could be relevant, they too were scanned in. It was an enormous task, but ultimately it helped lay the foundation for success later on.
Naturally, digitization on its own won't bring you success, but it does form the basis for making a sound evaluation.
And one of the ideas of the Johanna unit, as it was called in 2016 or 17, was to determine whether the central clues in the case, the partial handprint and the traces of fibre, had been adequately analysed in line with modern-day standards.
In May 2016, the Johanna unit got in touch and told us they were digitising the file and taking a fresh look at the case. This was followed by a meeting in which they asked us what, after 17 years, was now possible with regard to any traces that had been found. They wanted to know exactly what we had and whether there was anything else we could do. Everything had to be put on the table, so to speak, and reassessed.
After the file had been made suitable for research purposes and the names of all suspects fed in, it became clear that this Rick J. appeared in various areas. He had driven a Jetta and had already attracted attention with regard to sex offences. He appeared in many places in the file, although not always directly, and thus became a person of interest.
The new investigators decided very quickly that the Jetta lead was of crucial importance. They put together numerous pieces of evidence and said that Rick J., who had been interviewed originally and drove a Jetta, was their only really useful lead.
It all sounded so plausible. It almost gave me goosebumps.
The more I studied the circumstantial evidence against him, the more I believed that he could be the killer.
But it was just a gut feeling, because at this point in time the police had no concrete evidence.
But then another incident occurred in the Friedberg area, not far from Bobenhausen. Residents had heard suspicious noises coming from a cornfield.
Consequently, in a relatively dramatic discovery, a man was found engaging in sexual activity with a 14-year-old girl, and adhesive tape was being used.
Asked what was going on, the two said that it was their own business, and what they were doing was consensual.
The pair were found in the cornfield by a hunter.
We approached them from two sides. What I saw that day still sends a shiver down my spine. There was this man, completely naked, and kneeling in front of him was a young girl. She had nothing on but her panties, and her legs had been taped together.
The hunter and those with him confronted the man. "What are you doing?" they asked. "Who are you?"
He showed them a bank card. The name on it was Rick J. The men reported everything to the police. Because what took place in the cornfield seemed to have been consensual, no immediate action was taken.
However, it did mean that Rick J. had come to the attention of the police once again.
So was Rick J. little Johanna's murderer? Had he abducted her in 1999? Had Rick J. buried her body in the woods?
Sexually motivated criminals often develop an addiction and an increasing self-assurance. When they get away with a murder, a feeling of invulnerability sometimes develops. They haven't got me for 10 years, even 15 years. At some point, they become so self-assured that they think they'll never be caught. Even if what happened was more or less consensual, the fact that a second incident took place, in a cornfield, in public if you like, points to the apparent assurance of the perpetrator. It is certainly not an indication of remorse. Indeed, it shows emotional apathy and insensibility, and a total absence of any fear of detection and retribution.
The cornfield incident became the subject of a separate judicial inquiry. With the charge of sexual abuse of a minor hanging over him, the court ordered a search of the suspect's premises. It was carried out on February 2nd, 2017.
A large number of data storage devices were secured, including his cell phone.
Investigators also took a closer look at the accused's attic. For example, in one corner they found a small blue box, and in it was some adhesive tape.
Along with rope and other things that could have been used for tying someone up. They were all secured within the framework of the cornfield case and taken away for evaluation.
The accused seemed very relaxed. After all, being questioned by the police was nothing new for him. At the end of the interrogation, he said that the incident had taken place consensually. So, in that respect, he had done nothing wrong.
The young girl was quite a bit older than Johanna and physically more developed. But the parallel features, the rope and the adhesive tape told me that this was our man.
Naturally, we took a closer look at the evidence from the house search carried out in February 2017, especially the adhesive tape.
We wondered if we still had any items from Rick J.'s premises. Luckily we did. But where were they exactly? When we discovered that they had been sent to forensics, we ordered them to be returned. We were looking into a totally different case. We were thus able to bring items secured from a house search as part of the cornfield investigation and analyse them within the framework of the Johanna Bonacker case.
Angelika Schwetz searched for traces that Rick J. could have left with regard to the Johanna case.
We had a portfolio of pictures from the house search and wondered if it contained anything that was clearly old. There was this pair of jeans, almost certainly dating back to the 90s. We had objects from a box found in his attic. Old items of clothing, ropes, expanders, and rolls of adhesive tape. It was a sort of box you might have had in the boot of your car for putting things in. We'd have liked to have the box the way it was originally, because the first investigation had secured only a few items. So I put a yellow note in the portfolio asking, was the box once kept in the car? We knew that Rick J. used to drive a Jetta, so perhaps he'd had this box in the car at some time, taken it out and put it in his attic where it had remained for goodness knows how many years. My hope was that the box would still contain some traces dating back to 1999.
That was feasible because for the last 20 years Rick J had been living in a squalid one-room apartment. He was an unemployed messy. He hardly ever went out. He lived alone and he had no children. Rick J was a perfect match for the profile sketched by investigators.
We then had to think what our next steps would be. How many people would we need and what kind of structure? After all, we had secured an enormous amount of material that needed to be analysed for clues.
It was quite clear to me that this would be impossible with the structures we had in Friedberg. Only 2 officers could have been added to the 3 already working on the case.
So the chief of police in Gießen commissioned Commander Roland Fritsch to head a task force Johanna.
When I asked how big my team would be and what resources I would have at my disposal, the response was positive. So, in 2017, we really were able to establish a task force Johanna. Around 30 officers then took a completely new look at the case.
They studied the old file to see if it contained any evidence or leads that might still prove useful.
Every single page in the file was checked once again. As far as humanly possible, everything was reconstructed.
We even questioned police officers who were involved at the time.
The team also included Detective Superintendent Agathe Koch.
In such cases, you focus primarily on the victim and on the victim's environment. Naturally, we all studied the old file in great detail. And, I must say, on realising what a happy, lovable little girl Johanna was and how cherished she was, it was perhaps no bad thing that everything had happened 18 years ago, because that sort of crime really gets to you. Police officers are also human beings, but in such cases, we have to block out our emotions. As a rule, when someone goes missing or has been killed and you don't know who is responsible, it's a race against time. You have to try and get hold of information as fast as possible, so time is normally our worst enemy. But here we were in a comfortable situation because we had time.
We rented new rooms and set things up so that the task force could work in the best possible conditions.
Circumstantial evidence pointed to one suspect in particular. It wasn't someone totally unknown to us, and that was who we focused on.
The big question was, how could we prove his guilt? And I can well remember the first discussions I had with public prosecutor Thomas Hauburger about which strategy to adopt. He kept telling me that without a confession, it would be extremely difficult to get a conviction. So I realized that it was up to me to find sufficient proof, practically in the form of circumstantial evidence.
Rick J was now screened and shadowed for months on end. All information on him was stored at task force headquarters.
One group of colleagues focused solely on his personal life, from his birth right through to what was then the present. In other words, through to 2017.
My job at the task force Johanna was to focus solely on our suspect, Rick J, with the aim of interrogating him later. We tried to make a complete study of him, from his birth right through to the present. What kind of a person is he? What crimes has he committed? How was he at school? Does he have any noticeable problems? No stone was left unturned. We focused on his cars, his friends, and his social environment. And whatever we found was used to compile a picture of his life. It was like a tapestry, stretching out in our corridor. showing every event since his birth, whether he had committed any offences that ran parallel. Was there anything that could have triggered the murder of any other crimes? When I was evaluating all the information on his life story, I kept wondering what had turned someone whose initial circumstances in life were agreeable to become a killer. But I couldn't come up with an answer. The offences listed in his file mainly involved drugs and burglary.
But I also discovered that as a 17-year-old he had become a child molester. In a country lane, he had suddenly attacked a young girl who was also blonde and 8 years old. He'd thrown her to the ground and dropped on top of her. She was lucky that two cyclists appeared and chased him away. A few days after the attack, he was identified. That was several years before the murder of Johanna Bonnecker.
At the time he attacked the 8-year-old girl, he was 17 and still at school. When questioned, he said that his actions hadn't been sexually motivated. And back then, the police couldn't prove otherwise.
He later went on record for another incident involving child sexual abuse. He had engaged in sexual activity with an 11-year-old girl.
Had investigators in Rick J. come across a ruthless child abuser who also had Johanna on his conscience?
Naturally, opening an old case like this affects you emotionally, especially as it concerns the murder of a child, and you think about the family. But you review it in and perhaps give them fresh hope that the killer might finally be caught.
When Task Force Johanna began to take a hard look at the case, Rick J. was out of work. He had no regular income and rarely left his apartment in Friedrichsdorf. He often ordered food from delivery services. And he also spent a lot of time on the internet.
We kept a close watch on him. We knew at all times where he was and what he was doing. He could scarcely have been under greater surveillance.
We also used telecommunications surveillance. He was monitored more or less round the clock in order to produce a profile of his movements.
Our surveillance showed that he was active in internet forums and that he logged on to internet sites containing child pornography and so on. That was all carefully documented.
Our surveillance teams monitored his movements round the clock. If he cycled to the open-air swimming pool, for instance, they went with him. One night, he was also followed when he went out to steal potatoes from a field.
Obviously, surveillance like that can't be justified where the theft of potatoes is concerned. But when a serious crime is involved and the appropriate court order has been obtained, the Code of Criminal Procedure does allow suspects to be monitored. Their phones can be bugged and their internet activities tracked.
Task Force Johanna in Friedrichsdorf near Frankfurt kept Rick J. under surveillance for almost 6 months.
With the cornfield incident in mind, one major problem we faced in carrying out our investigations was, of course, the latent threat that Rick J. posed to other young girls. The images we had secured on his data carriers made this patently clear. Stored on his cell phone were pictures of young girls with long blonde hair and around 8 to 10 years old. He'd taken them on their way to school or in a school bus. Obviously, Someone like that poses a latent threat.
We were dealing with a main suspect who showed very little movement. So at least we weren't worried that he might destroy evidence, especially as he had no idea that he was under surveillance as a suspect in the Johanna Bonacker case.
Surveillance is an extremely difficult and sensitive phase because obviously the aim is to gather fresh evidence. What investigators are looking for is a clear link. An SMS, a forum entry, a direct or indirect confession, or perhaps a return to the scene of the crime. But sometimes, the moment a person suspects they are under surveillance, they destroy any evidence. Then, hard drives are wiped and hardly anything is left. So there's a thin line between obtaining information and losing it. Then, of course, there's the fact that we're probably dealing with a child killer. So there's a danger of another crime being committed at any time. It's a phase, then, in which the public prosecutor and the head of the task force don't sleep too well.
Investigators urgently needed a breakthrough. They didn't have much to go on, certainly no solid evidence.
Wir haben ja das Klebeband in seiner Wohnung.
We found the adhesive tape in his apartment and gave it to the State Office of Criminal Investigation. When it was examined for fingerprints and traces of fiber, the result was staggering.
Bahnbrechenden Ergebnis.
Es war dann auch so, dass die Kollegin, die damals schon die Klebebänder untersucht hat, die auch dieses Fingerabdruckfragment auf Spur 11 gefunden
The
hat.
colleague who had made the original examination of the yellow tapes and found the fingerprint on trace 11 doggedly pursued the case and also discovered similar traces on other items belonging to Rick J.
2017 mal zur Mittagszeit, ich sollte doch mal gucken kommen. Und da habe ich schon gedacht, mal gucken, was
In
ist.
July 2017, she rang me and told me to come round. She then showed me 2 fibres under the microscope, traces from Johanna Bonacker alongside those from Rick J's tape. And they were a perfect match.
Und es sah perfekt aus, es sah gut aus. Und das war ja das erste Mal seit...
After 18 years, this was the first time we had found fibres that really did coincide. You never forget a moment like that. I certainly won't.
Das wird sich für immer bei mir eingebrannt haben beim Gehirn. Bin ich natürlich hingegangen, habe die AG angerufen.
I rang the task force and said I'd like a meeting. This was quickly arranged, and Roland Fritsch and 2 colleagues from the task force came here. When we told them we had a hit, that we had found fibres from Rick J's belongings that were a perfect match with those from Johanna, they were amazed.
Übereinstimmende Fasern beim Rick J. Und damit waren die dann alle etwas sehr erstaunt.
The match under the microscope was the first verifiable link between Rick J. and 8-year-old Johanna.
Und das war ein Ergebnis.
It was a result that surprised us all. Naturally, we then felt confident because it proved we were on the right track.
Bewiesen hat, dass wir hier auf der richtigen Spur sind.
It is unusual for such solid evidence to be found after such a long time. It was probably due to the fact that he was still living in the same apartment.
It was, of course, electrifying to think that after so many years, the very same fibres from the site where the body was found should also have been discovered on items belonging to our suspect.
Ist das natürlich elektrisierend gewesen.
Could Johanna's murder thus have been solved with the help of a minute, inconspicuous fibre?
The file also contained a picture of Johanna, which had been used in the search for her. It was always one of the first pictures you saw opening the file. The picture was a constant incentive for us to say, this child was a victim, and it's not only our legal, but also our personal duty to find her killer.
But to arrest Rick J., they needed not only the fibres attached to the tape, but also the object they had come from, like a blanket or something similar from the Jetta he drove at the time.
We'd have loved to have gone straight to Rick J's apartment and turned it over in search of the box, because for comparison purposes, we had to find traces somewhere else. If it had been up to me, that step would have been taken the very next day. But there was so much to be taken into consideration and still to be investigated that in the short term, there was nothing we could do. OK, I said, then make sure nothing from the apartment gets lost.
Sometimes the time of an arrest has more to do with intuition than information. You have to weigh up which likelihood is greater, that the next few days will produce fresh information of substantial importance, or that the subject will become suspicious and destroy evidence. There's probably no perfect time for an arrest. Usually, it's the result of close coordination between the public prosecutor and the police and a mixture of experience, luck and intuition.
Ein Mix aus Erfahrung, Glück und Intuition.
But before arresting the suspect, investigators had Trace 11, the partial fingerprint of the adhesive tape used to bind Johanna, analyzed once again.
For years we had one big problem with Trace 11, the partial fingerprint on the adhesive tape where Johanna's remains were found. We had no idea how conclusive it might prove. Would the tiny bit of information contained in this small print be enough to identify someone beyond all doubt?
The problem was that we didn't have a complete fingerprint, just a small fragment of a possible fingerprint. It might also have been a handprint. So this, of course, made our investigation considerably more difficult.
Originally, specialists had said that the trace contained too few anatomical features for it to serve as adequate evidence for gaining a conviction.
Rick J.
had been fingerprinted and photographed once again in connection with the cornfield incident. But now his fingerprints had been scanned using new, state-of-the-art methods. The wording in the old files concerning the evaluation and suitability of the fragment of a finger or handprint was contradictory and ambiguous. But now, through Thomas Hauburger, we had another, clarifying report from the Federal Office of Criminal Investigation. We were over the moon when we learnt that it was certainly possible to determine anatomical features on the fragment.
Und auch dort bekamen wir dann eine Rückmeldung, die uns
The report surprised and delighted us
gestimmt hat, weil
because we knew it was the next step on the trail of the killer.
die Spur des Beschuldigten führt.
Von daher gesehen hatten wir dann
We now had order in our file. Basically, as far as possible, we got rid of all the old stuff. We tied up all loose ends. We had certainty with regard to the fibers and the fingerprint. So, we had actually reached the stage that had been our goal right from the start, to make progress, even without a confession.
auch ein Stadium erreicht, das wir eigentlich von Anfang an angestrebt haben, dass wir vielleicht auch ohne Geständnis weiterkommen.
Our surveillance was virtually complete. We said it was unlikely that we'd discover anything new, so our thoughts turned to an arrest. Naturally, we were also worried that the suspect might commit another crime, because we had no idea what might have happened in the 4 months before we had him under surveillance, or even before then.
Dass wir gesagt haben, okay.
So we said, okay, let's talk to Thomas Hauburger about having him arrested.
Wir nehmen ihn fest.
Rick J. had no idea that the police had been watching him for months. He felt secure. He surfed on the internet. He continued to download child pornography. Time and again, he also searched for information on the murder of Johanna Bonacker.
I asked colleagues if Rick J. was still living at the same address he had in 1999. Yes, they said. And he's a Messi. Right, I thought. This is our chance, because Messis don't throw anything away. We'll just have to turn his apartment inside out and upside down and see what we can find after so many years.
Angelika Schwetz was hoping to find textiles Rick J. had used years ago in abducting Johanna. The fibers could then be used to convict him.
Das war ein sehr, sehr besonderer Tag für mich in meiner Karriere.
It was probably the most important day of my entire career. Just imagine, we had been investigating for a whole year and almost gone crazy compiling circumstantial evidence. And now we believed we had identified the killer. But that was still only what we suspected. We didn't know for certain, so we were nervous. Perhaps there was a plausible explanation for all the circumstantial evidence we had collected. If there was, our entire case would just collapse.
Und dann fällt dieses Beweisgerüst einfach in sich zusammen.
We thought long and hard about the arrest. In such cases, murder and so on, it is customary for a special commando unit to kick in the door with a real hullabaloo.
But there was also the consideration that he might then think, if that's how the police are going to treat me, I'm not going to tell them a thing.
That would have torpedoed any hope of a productive interview. When someone is surprised by being arrested in such a high dramatic fashion, you can imagine that their readiness to talk is likely to be minimal.
People react to pressure in different ways. For some, pressure or the severity of the state is the only language they understand. For others, just the opposite holds true. As soon as they feel pressure or force, they clam up. What sort of a person was Rick J? He was someone who, in his mind, his life and his past relationships, was a control addict. He wanted to be in charge. How he was seen was important to him. He wanted to have power and control. He didn't want a special police unit to kick the door in, but to approach him, give him the feeling that he was accompanying them voluntarily, even though the decision was not his. But that was exactly the right approach.
It was important for the arrest to take place calmly and quietly, for the suspect to feel respected, to know that we were not bursting in with a special force commando unit, but wanted to create a basis for communication. We wanted him to feel that we wanted to give him the opportunity to talk to us, and not to think that we had already branded him a child killer, but were prepared to talk to him at any time. I can well remember October 10th, 2017. I got up early. It was cool and dry outside. A perfect day, in fact.
On that day, there are a lot of people at the control center, all the members of the task force and other high-ranking officers who were in charge of the operation.
Because everything had to be coordinated. Was he at home? Would everything go as planned? To ensure our safety, we agreed that my colleague, Mr. Kessler, and I would stand at the door together with 2 officers from the mobile task force, theoretically to protect us if he turned violent, because he felt he had nothing to lose. Outside the house, we met Mrs. Schvetz from the State Office of Criminal Investigation and all the other units. But then the technology let us down. That is why everything was slightly delayed. Police work often involves waiting, so that's what we had to do for a while. Finally, at 7:20, we rang his doorbell. When Rick J. opened the door, at first I was surprised. For the last 4 months, I'd done virtually nothing else but study him. I had pictures of him and knew what kind of a person he was, so to speak. So you have this certain image in mind. But there I was with this really small man in front of me, a totally nondescript figure. It made me think. I know we've got the right person, but still, it all seems a bit strange. As we stood in the doorway, we noticed that he was very nervous.
We told him that he was being arrested and why, and that he had the right to contact a lawyer and so on. He seemed totally relaxed, quite reasonable in fact. He offered no resistance and didn't cause any trouble.
He then sat on the edge of the bed, asked if he could smoke, and read through our search warrant. We soon realised that he was highly intelligent. He'd sussed the situation immediately and was wondering how he could get out of it. There must be some mistake, he said. I bet you've construed something. No, we replied, it's about the murder of Johanna Bornacker. That's nonsense, he said. I might have done a lot of shitty things in my life. That was his word, shitty. But murder, never. And how did you get onto me, he asked. Mr. Kessler said, it's all in the search warrant. Yes, he replied, I've read it, but there's got to be more to it than that. Mr. Kessler then told him that we had the two traces, the fingerprint and the fibre, but Rick J. repeatedly asked for more concrete evidence. Look, we told him, we'll take you to the police station and do what we have to. Then we'll discuss everything with you in peace and quiet.
He then spoke to his neighbour and asked him to tell his father that he needed a lawyer.
He then stuffed a few thick books into a paper bag, a few fantasy novels, I can't remember the titles, refueled his gas lighter and pocketed several cigarettes. We then cuffed him hand and foot, because although he was being nice and cooperative, the moment we left he might have turned nasty. So we thought it was sensible to take preventive measures.
So for 18 years, a suspected child killer lived freely among us in Friedrichsdorf near Frankfurt.
My washing machine was on the floor above, so I often went past his flat. I think he was very lonely. I just can't believe it. He was always so polite and friendly. He'd always say hello. I'm amazed.
Man kommt einfach nicht drauf.
After making the arrest, we immediately carried out a search of his apartment. To make our task easier, we rented an apartment under his, which just happened to be empty. Together with experts, we then went through his flat with a fine-tooth comb. Basically, we were looking for anything that fibers might have come from. Everything we came across was meticulously documented and photographed in the apartment we had rented.
We decided to search room by room, starting with the attic. We were looking for things that were old, something that must have been around in 1999. Lying next to a grating, we saw two dark grey fluffy covers for the front seats of a car and two more that must have been for the back seats. They'd lost their shape a bit, but you could still tell what they were for.
Did the seat covers come from the VW Jetta used to abduct Johanna in 1999? Would investigators find the same fibers they had discovered on the adhesive tape?
We looked at one another and thought, that has got to be what we're after.
We were very lucky that he had this tendency to save things for a long time. We found written evidence dating back to his early school days, in which he had noted certain sexual inclinations and other things. That, I must say, was most unusual.
But why did Rick J. save everything? Did he feel so secure? Was Johanna perhaps not his only victim? What would investigators find on his hard drives?
In all, I think we took around 7 terabytes of data from his apartment. Forensic evaluation of his storage media took 10 colleagues more than half a year.
Investigators found an enormous amount of video material in Rick J's apartment. It enabled them to draw three major conclusions. First, there was the content. It was all about fettering, power, control and humiliation. Secondly, there was the storage media. Ranging from floppy disks to USB sticks, they covered a time period of at least 20 years. And that then provided an interesting insight into how long he had had these obsessions. There is actually only one explanation for collecting such a vast amount of material. Where the portrayal of child abuse is concerned, material is very difficult to obtain. So he produced a lot of the video material himself. The only thing to be drawn from this is that from morning till night, he must have done nothing else.
Rick J's film material was so perverted and abnormal that even experienced investigators were shocked. Rick J was a nondescript figure. He lived alone and rarely went out. Born in Bad Nauheim in 1976, he was given up for adoption. He left grammar school with good marks and got a place at university to study biochemistry, but he dropped out. When Rick J was arrested, police found his apartment in a sorry state.
To the relief of people in South Hesse, police have announced the arrest of a murder suspect.
Over all those years, police in Friedberg in central Hesse never stopped looking for the killer of Johanna Bonnacker.
For nearly 20 years, police took thousands of fingerprints and followed thousands of leads, but to no avail. Now, 18 years after the crime, they have arrested a suspect.
With us now is Thomas Hauburger from the Public Prosecutor's Office in Gießen. Mr. Hauburger, could you tell us how the breakthrough in the case came about?
We found traces of fibre, matching those discovered on adhesive tape at the site where the body was found.
How did Johanna's family react to news of the arrest after 18 long years?
For the family, of course, the situation has involved a great deal of emotional stress. To avoid causing any more stress through a sudden news release, we brought Johanna's mother in yesterday, so she was put fully in the picture beforehand. It was the first time I had met her personally. It was also one of the most difficult situations in my professional career because it had nothing to do with law or criminology. It was something very personal because basically I was tearing a mother out of her everyday routine once again, just like she had been torn out of it in 1999. And I was confronting her with the circumstances once more.
Mr. Hauburger and I, we told her we were fairly certain that we had the right man. After so many years, that, of course, came as quite a shock to her. But she collected herself and seemed totally relieved. She thanked us and said she would first have to let everything sink in. We drove her back home and she gave the news to her other children. Her husband had passed away some time ago. At first, I think the whole family was simply stunned.
Rick J was arrested in his apartment, and first he didn't want to say anything, but that, of course, was his right.
We then drove him from Friedrichsdorf to Gießen. After reading him his rights, we had our first talk with him in the vehicle.
We knew from the many police interviews with him how he would basically react. That at first he wouldn't say anything, but would then get curious. These were all aspects of great importance to us.
The drive back took 45 minutes. There were 5 of us in the transporter along with the suspect. He kept asking how we had come to focus on him. Again, we told him about the fingerprint. Yes, he said, but you checked me out originally and found nothing. You couldn't prove anything, so you let me go. But I told him we had reopened the case and were now using a new technique, and said that an outer trace of his left thumb had now been found. He then kept looking at his left thumb and wanted more precise information. Did we really have enough against him? We said that we had found fibres in his flat, which matched the fibre on the adhesive tape used to bind Johanna. He seemed impressed that we had spent so much time investigating him. Maybe the story with the clues wasn't as construed as he had thought. We then started looking out of the window instead of dealing with him. But he kept coming back to the fibre trace and asking why it hadn't been found originally. He then switched to other issues. He wanted to sound as innocuous as possible. He told us about his car, saying he'd bought it from a friend. He'd often worked on it, but because he'd always drunk so much, in the end he always had screws left over. Trivial things like that. We began our interview at 9:15. At the time we only had circumstantial evidence. So we needed a confession. But the more pressure you are under to obtain a confession, the least likely you are to get one. So it was important for us to be confident that, even without a confession, we would be fine. We couldn't show we were under pressure, because he would have felt it. His lawyer still hadn't put in an appearance, so we waited. Mr. Kessler and I were alone in the interview room with Rick J. He kept asking about the traces. Why did they point to him? Why hadn't we focused on him originally? We said it wasn't about him. We were certain he was the killer. It was all about the details. That's what we needed to know. We said there would be a press release the next day, naming him as the killer, and told him this was now his chance to say something. "I'll have to think about it," was his reply.
In negotiations, it's always good, and in this case perhaps useful, to give the impression that a confession is not essential. The CIA calls this tactic the all-seeing eye. The suggestion being that we know everything anyway, we've got enough evidence as it is.
We felt it important to tell him that Johanna's family finally needed to put a name and a face to the man who had taken their beloved daughter. Hearing that, he turned away from us. He hid his face in his hands, but we could see through his fingers that he was rolling his eyes. We could tell that he was really thinking hard, probably reassessing the information we had given him. After all, he'd had 18 years to prepare for the moment when the police knocked on his door and told him he was being arrested on suspicion of murder. And now they had actually come with evidence. So somehow, he thought, "I've got to handle this." We reckoned he'd had 3 cigarettes, but he crossed that out in his statement, saying he'd only smoked 2. Mr. Kessler then asked him if he'd decided anything. Rick J. put his hand up and said, "Give me a second." We didn't interrupt. He then wanted to use the bathroom. "Tell your typist," he said, "that I need to talk to you." His first words then were, "The parents have a right to know what happened to their child. And you are correct. I am responsible."
Und Sie haben recht, ich bin dafür verantwortlich.
During the interview, the lawyer rang up. "Okay," we said, "that's as far as we'll get. He will advise his client not to say anything. We can end the interview." But Rick J. actually told the lawyer what we had said to him previously, that it was all about the details. "They're treating me well," he said. That was precisely what we wanted to hear. It confirmed that our approach was justified, and then he told us what had happened.
He admitted to having drugged Johanna with chloroform. He then crudely bound her and put her in the boot of his car. A short time later, he pulled up and opened the boot because she had come round and was kicking against the lid. When she almost jumped out, he hit her in the face with the back of his hand to subdue her. In doing so, he said, he might have broken her nose. Later, when she was no longer breathing, he thought she might have suffocated on her own vomit because of the tape. He told us how important it was to him to rule out any chance of being identified, so he had taped her eyes shut and also put tape over her mouth. But he'd made sure her nose was free so that she could breathe. He stressed time and again that on no account did he want anything to happen to her.
Naturally, we didn't interrupt him. We only put our questions when he'd finished. The way he explained what had happened was so devoid of emotion, so impersonal, that you'd never have thought he was talking about a murder, even though he was presenting it as an accident. It's like me telling you about a meal I cooked yesterday. It was so surreal. He told his story as if it had all been an accident.
He didn't want to do anything bad to her, he said, apart from abuse her sexually. That wasn't so bad in his eyes, and he certainly didn't intend to kill her.
We expected him to portray everything as an accident, perhaps so that he himself would find it easier to live with. No one would ever freely state that they were responsible for the death of an 8-year-old girl after, say, sexually abusing her.
Did he himself believe this version? I don't think so. He was clearly a sadist, and causing suffering was one of the main motives of his actions.
In a way, he started to enjoy being interrogated. You got the impression that he was the one who was calling the shots. He really dictated his statement.
He corrected any typing mistakes, because when you're typing really fast, it is easier to make the odd error. But he even added words. He'd put in an asterisk here and there and write something at the foot of the page. He'd even rephrase or cross something out if he wasn't happy with it. He read through his statement almost as if he were the school teacher, making notes and correcting. When he was finally satisfied, he signed it.
The interrogation lasted all day. That same evening, he was taken before a magistrate.
We'd like to have asked a lot more questions, because the situation immediately after an arrest, when the suspect wants to make a statement, can't be repeated. Even after just one night's sleep, the situation is totally different. The suspect has had time to think and prepare himself.
Our application was for him to be remanded on suspicion of murder. This would give the judge the opportunity to work through the evidence we had presented and form her own opinion, because the decision was hers alone. A brief hearing took place, and that same day the judge ruled that Rick J. should be taken into custody.
While Rick J. was in custody, the items secured in the house search were being analyzed at the State Office of Criminal Investigation.
That same evening, we received the covers obtained through the search warrant. Our colleagues inspected them the next day and said that they fitted. That was a good feeling.
The fiber match proved that Johanna really was abducted by Rick J. in his Jetta. The police, at least, no longer had any doubts.
I can still see me sitting there with Mr. Hauburger and all the colleagues who had organized the operation. We had this feeling of total relief. It was very emotional. We had made this breakthrough, and all our work had been right. But if anyone thought that this was the end of the matter, they were wrong. A mountain of work still lay ahead of us. Nevertheless, we all had this sense of relief.
Even after the arrest, we still had to know how Johanna had died. Could an accident be totally ruled out? Could we really believe what the suspect had told us?
We reconstructed in minute detail everything he had told us and videotaped it. We got hold of an equivalent VW Jetta and revisited the crime scene.
It was a reconstruction. It wasn't an actual occurrence. But even so, time and again, the whole scenario aroused memories of what had actually taken place.
Had Rick J. deliberately killed Johanna out of base motives? Or had she really suffocated in the boot?
We asked colleagues who reconstructed the scene and filmed it all from a drone what angle he could have seen Johanna from. Did everything take place the way he described it? We reconstructed the whole abduction situation. We called in experts. We wanted to know how long ether or chloroform would have had an effect because he wasn't certain which of them he had used.
We reconstructed everything, right from her abduction by the stream.
We then asked ourselves if it was at all possible to suffocate in the boot of a Jetta. Together with the police and the experts we had called in, we turned to a pediatrician at the University Hospital in Gießen, at the head of its anaesthesiological department, and asked them to carry out an experiment. Under close medical supervision, a volunteer from police circles then served as a guinea pig to see whether someone could suffocate in a car boot within 2 hours, because that was the time window mentioned by the accused. The answer was no. It was simply impossible.
So how did Johanna die?
At the scene where Johanna's body was found, we recovered around 15 meters of adhesive parcel tape and a large amount of duct tape. We tried to wrap 15 meters of tape around something the size of a child's head while making sure that the nose stayed free. We gave it a good try, but it just couldn't be done. We wrapped tape around the head about 29 times until there was nowhere left to wrap. So the result of our experiment was clear. But why 15 meters of adhesive tape? Just so as not to be recognized?
A person who wraps tape around someone's head 29 times wants to kill them, or at least takes their death into account.
Rick J. claimed he had not planned the crime. The abduction was a spontaneous act. Only afterwards had he stolen a rope from a paddock to bind her with, and then driven to Nidda, 6 kilometers away, to buy the adhesive tape.
We now tried to reconstruct the timescale. First, we needed to know how long it takes to drive from Bobenhausen to the filling station in Nidda. Is it really possible to stop along the way, steal a rope, and tie someone up? Here too, investigators said, no, it isn't.
We also had this witness at a filling station in Nidda who was certain that she had seen the Jetta with a Bad Homburg number plate. She was also certain that the driver had been a young man with a ponytail and glasses. He'd walked around the filling station shop as if he was looking for something.
It must have been Rick J., but we wanted to know at precisely what time the man had shown up. She said it was roughly between 5:45 and 6 p.m. But we needed to know exactly.
Only then could they refute Rick J.'s version of events.
Rick J. told us that he had first bought adhesive tape at the filling station, but the witness said he hadn't purchased anything, that he'd left the filling station empty-handed. And besides that, the filling station had never stocked duct tape or parcel tape.
Something else happened there that we could never have imagined, because nearly 20 years after the crime, we were able to say that Rick J. had been at the filling station at precisely 5:41 p.m. The filling station was still leased by the same person, and he told us that he still had the cash journal from September 2nd, 1999. So we checked it out. Our female witness said she had sold Rick J. a pack of Caprice cigarettes, and a sales receipt proved that the cigarettes were in fact purchased at 5:41 p.m. We knew that the witness had got the time exactly right. We compared this with the driving time we had reconstructed and knew that he could never have stopped at the paddock. It was simply impossible in such a short space of time.
What had Rick J. claimed at this point in time? He said he had never abused Johanna. He claimed everything had happened spontaneously. It hadn't been planned. He had the rope from the paddock and the adhesive tape from the filling station. And he said he had not wanted to kill her. That was just unfortunate. She had suffocated in the boot by accident. It was simply outstanding that after 18 years the police were still able to refute his claims and prove his guilt. They were able to prove that his actions were not spontaneous and that he would not have had time to stop at the paddock, that the filling station had never stocked adhesive tape of any kind, and that it was highly unlikely someone would have suffocated in the boot of a car within 2 hours. The boot just couldn't be sealed that tightly. For all that to have been proved after 18 years was rare, a mixture of criminological experience, outstanding ability and luck.
Und eine Mischung aus kriminalistischer Erfahrung, extremem Geschick und Glück.
By now, investigators feared that Rick J. might also have committed similar crimes.
The Special Task Force also focused on murders that were committed in Hesse in the mid-90s and, at an early stage, were brought into connection with the disappearance of Johanna Bonacker.
There was the Melanie Frank case in Wiesbaden and that of Annika Seidel from Hofheim, who to this day has never been found.
Naturally, we also asked ourselves whether our suspect might be a serial killer.
We made every effort to see if there was any evidence to support this.
For example, we also found some children's jackets in his apartment. Since we had no idea where the clothing had come from, we decided to ask him. In early January, Mrs. Koch and I visited him in prison in Gießen to see what explanation he would come up with.
He seemed relaxed. I think he had come to terms with his situation. He had found his place and it was fine for him.
It was quite a lengthy interview. He was quite willing to make a statement, but what he said didn't give us any grounds for further suspicion. He denied being involved in any other crimes.
But I think more has happened than he's admitted.
Despite intensive efforts and sound research, we could find no concrete evidence linking him to the two other abductions.
We've never been able to prove that he was in any way connected with those cases.
Were there other victims? The answer is yes, because for many years he consumed child pornography. And that's nothing other than indirect child abuse. Have there been other victims of voyeurism? Most certainly. And victims of sex offences, as in the Cornfield case? In all likelihood, yes. Because that offence was discovered more by chance. Other murder victims, perhaps? That's hard to say. At this point in time, that would be speculation. But other questions need to be asked. Where did the children's clothing in his apartment come from? And how can the similarities to other cases be explained with regard to time, place and mode?
Und wie erklären sich die Parallelen zu anderen Fällen, sowohl inhaltlich als auch örtlich als auch zeitlich?
Ende Januar, Anfang Februar.
As public prosecutor, in late January and early February, I had to decide how to proceed.
Und insbesondere, was ist ihm eigentlich jetzt?
Should the suspect stand trial? And what specifically should he be charged with?
Der Hauptprobleme
One of our main problems was the actual cause of death and whether we could meet all the prerequisites for a murder charge. And if so, what exactly were they? Could we prove that a sex offence had been committed? These questions were hard to answer on both a factual and a legal level, because we knew relatively little about the core issue, just how the little girl had met her death. Ultimately, the charge read, murder in connection with a sex offence. And since we found child pornography on his data carriers, he also was charged with being in possession of the material.
Dateien befunden hat.
It looks like a breakthrough has been made in an old case and that after almost 20 years, a murder has been solved. In 1999, 8-year-old Johanna from Hesse went missing. For a long time, police found neither her body nor her killer. Now a suspect has been arrested and will face trial.
It's the crime that has shocked and moved the people of Hesse more than any other. The case involving 8-year-old Johanna Bornacker, whose remains were found in a wood in 2000. Now, after nearly 20 years, investigators have made an arrest.
In court, Thomas Hauburger had no concrete evidence proving that the accused had actually murdered the victim. However, he was able to refute Rick J's statements and base his arguments on circumstantial evidence and witnesses, like a former live-in girlfriend who told the court about perverse sexual practices and bondage. But would that be enough for a murder conviction? Or would Rick J be able to avoid a life sentence?
I was surprised to see Rick J because he had changed so much. He seemed so withdrawn. He was holding a pen, but he wasn't making any notes. He never once looked at me. Not that I was at all interested in making eye contact with him. In fact, he didn't look at anybody. He just kept staring at his pen. In the studio with us today is our court reporter, Heike Berufka. We've heard from the courtroom. The accused has lied. He has a difficult character. He used drugs. What is your impression of him?
What I find hard to explain is this lack of empathy, this total insensitivity. He starts every other sentence with the word I. He's full of this holier-than-thou self-perception and, as the accused, even interrupts the judge. That's not only cocky, it's also unbelievably ill-advised and shows just how this man ticks.
Just like in his police interview, for the accused, it wasn't about the victim or the family. By and large, it was about him personally, about the rest of his life, about his punishment. The suffering, his deeds, and empathy played only a minor role. But when the focus was on his punishment, a conviction for manslaughter or for murder, and on his life and the consequences of his actions, he was wide awake. Then he paid attention, because how he was seen was highly important to him.
Johanna's mother wanted to be in court and look the man in the face who took her beloved daughter's life. This trial will be immensely difficult for Gabriele Bornacker because it will bring her face to face with the man accused of murdering her daughter.
For nearly 19 years, Johanna's mother has been desperate to know who killed her daughter and why. Now she has the chance to find answers.
This won't put an end to things. For me, this is an endless story. I just want everything to be over as fast as possible. For the court to come to the appropriate verdict.
Das
ist so eine starke Frau, vor der ich so großen Respekt habe.
Such a strong woman. I have so much respect for her. That is why I tried not to be too graphic in court, to express myself as gently as possible so as not to cause too much pain to the family. But she, too, had read the file. She knows the details. That is perhaps why I was slightly self-conscious. Because I knew the mother was sitting in the background, hearing everything he had done. hearing about the final hours in her daughter's life.
Ihre Tochter.
This is a very strong woman who has herself very much under control. You can see the stress she's under. But you have to remember what she has had to hear about what happened. Today, for example, the accused showed how he tied up Johanna like a parcel, with her hands behind her and her legs together. Then he lay down on the floor in front of this woman and showed it all. How is anyone expected to cope with that?
In November 2018, the court in Gießen reached its verdict. It followed Public Prosecutor Thomas Hauburger's recommendation and sentenced Rick J. to life imprisonment.
A huge weight has been lifted from my shoulders. The judgment is what I hoped for. The severest sentence possible. It is what I wanted. There is no just punishment. But he was handed the most any court could give, so I feel a lot better now than I did a week ago.
The court not only passed a guilty verdict, it also determined an extra severity of guilt. It concurred with the Public Prosecutor's Office in Gießen that the accused had also attempted to commit at least one sex offence, and that the tape wrapped around the victim's head had played a role in her death.
The court in Gießen today sentenced the killer of Johanna Bonacker to life imprisonment.
The work carried out by the police was never questioned, not even by the defense. Everything we had done was accepted just the way it was. No one claimed we had made a mistake somewhere. And that, of course, made us feel proud. It was confirmation that the way we had conducted our investigation was extremely sound.
A short time later, in February 2019, Roland Fritsch retired. But the Johanna Bonacker case still preoccupies him even today, and not only him.
The task force's goal was, of course, to see the suspect convicted. My personal wish was for the killer to be given a name and a face, and for the family to find peace and closure. It was not only the family who suffered and lived in fear, so did the whole village. Until Rick J. was apprehended, theoretically, everyone in the village was a suspect. Whenever a case involves a child, it is always difficult.
Until you know who killed your child, you cannot focus on grieving. You are driven by the thought of who could have done it. That, I believe, is why it is so important to open up these cold cases and find out who committed the crime. When they have this knowledge, it makes it easier for the family to find closure. Because someone who, under such circumstances, has lost a person they held dear can never find complete closure. But it does at least go some way to enabling them to perhaps find peace.